been very interesting. One of the moments. They have been very timely, challenging, difficult subjects. It is my great pleasure, honor to introduce Giles in his introduction. Really, he's now, and I thank the Ambassador of Australia for being here, he's now in Australia after being a professor of Oxford for many years. He's now at the University of Sydney, and he's a Chinese professor of English there. And Giles has been opening new interpretative horizons for the study of American literature for quite a while. And he's been always rejecting insularized or reductive isolationist outputs on American culture. So we are expecting him to do exactly that today. This is why he has been the president of the International American Studies Association, and I would underline International American Studies because it is much more hemispheric and branching out to many lessons. Australian thing. He is also the author of the book that you have there, that was just recently published in paperback, which is Anthropocene America, Australasia, and the Constitution of U.S. Literature. Also, the global remapping of American literature, transnationalism in practice, essays on American studies, literature, and religion, Atlantic Republic, the American tradition in English literature, virtual Americas, transnational fiction and the transatlantic imaginary, transatlantic insurrections, British cultural formation of American culture, and so on and so on. So I stop here because you all came here to hear him talk about, and let me lost homelands, the expropriation, not appropriation, the expropriation of American studies in the Anthropocene era. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you for that introduction. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the Australian ambassador to Portugal for being here. I had a mild altercation at the Lisbon airport yesterday, just as I was coming in, long queue for taxis, and a woman accused me of trying to barge in line, to jump in line with you, and she said, "That's typical of you British." I said, "I'm not British, I'm Australian." So anyway, that's having been 6 years in Sydney, I take that responsibility. What I have done is put the words that, or the books and the articles that I'm going to refer to on a handout, because that's just going to make things a little easier for you. You'll hear a word like alouette and you think, well, what on earth is that? But that just means that you have it down there in black and white, which hopefully should make things a little easier for me to, and let's see if we can, what's the full screen, full screen. Thank you very much. Yeah, that makes sense. So I'd like to thank Susanna and the other members of the organising committee in Lisbon for organising this symposium, and to Amy Kaplan for taking the time to come over from Pennsylvania. Amy and I go back a long way professionally, to the time when she was president of the American Studies Association some 13 years ago now, and I served as president of the International American Studies Association shortly afterwards. And it's a particular pleasure to have this opportunity to consider ways in which the formations of American studies have changed over the past half generation or so. The protagonist in Goethe's novel The Man and 50 talks of how he is becoming historical to myself, as he puts it. And there is, I think, an interesting historical dimension that we can begin now to perceive more clearly, starting from the ebullient but in retrospect perhaps somewhat naive liberal internationalism of the 1990s, the Bill Clinton era, through the trauma of 9/11 in 2001, and then on through the George W. Bush decade, when the idea of homeland first became a mantra of the US security state. Indeed, when cultural historians in future generations look back to the post-9/11 decade, it would not be surprising if they came to regard homeland as one of its key terms, much as utopia was a key term of the 1960s or conspiracy of the 1970s, since the idea of protecting the homeland has become an integral part of American and other Western cultures. The television series Homeland, which premiered in 2011 and was, as Amy was saying this morning, based originally on the Israeli series Prisoners of War, typically touched all the nerves that have become integral to the US cultural imagination over the past decade. National security, the protection of children and the family as icons that need safeguarding, the dangerous proximity between domestic and overseas territory, and the way these are mediated through new technology, data breaches, computer file transfers, and so on. I'm just going to play a very brief clip, if I can find it, from the trailer to Series 5. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but just for those of you who haven't seen it, this gives a good idea of the... is there any sound on this? No, it doesn't matter so much. No.
Auto journalists decided to visit General Audio Camp, Lebanon.
Hell's breaking loose down there.
I think that's a good idea. Marching a billionaire.
War zone?
You're CIA.
I was in the CIA. I'm a private citizen now.
Got a data breach in Berlin.
Shut it down. Shut it down. Shut it down.
Holy shit, this is CIA.
Please tell me I'm wrong, but it looks like they got all the documentation on our surveillance program with the Germans.
You're not wrong. I got an email from a hacker. Germany's doing an end run around its privacy laws by having the US do the spying for them.
How do you know it's real?
That's why I'm here. I need you to verify it. I can't even look at it. It would violate my agreement with the agency. You can take a girl out of the CIA, but, you know.
Does that look like it?
Same way as the penetration.
Just think Kerry's involved. The operation is over. That's just...
That character is Saul, who Amy described as the kind of heart of the series, the kind of CIA.
Thank you, brother. Trusting you was a mistake.
Germans aren't on board for this anymore.
All you get is that key. Your next target on the box, and operating money waiting there will bring back proof of death. To the edge of the box, I'll take care of anyone you put that. 2 minutes to prepare yourself for paradise. Nothing has made the world more dangerous in the last 15 years than the foreign policy of the United States.
All that suffering and nothing changes. Somebody betrayed us.
You think?
I know that what you're doing will get good people hurt.
What are you talking for?
I'm just trying to do good work.
Well, you're not. You're being naive and stupid.
Take it. Maybe I knew someday the past would catch up with me.
The terrorists are still out there, and that problem is not going away.
It's a terrific series, I think, kind of James Bond on speed in some ways. But it's interesting that the time frame, which is mentioned there in the trailer, is the last 15 years. You know, the idea of really since 2000 entering a new kind of era in terms of the security notion. We see another version of this fetishization of the idea of homeland in the popular reaction against migrants through many parts of Europe and Australia, where of course the issue of boat people has become Nope. Sorry. How do you go to the full screen?
F5.
F5. There you go. Got it. Yeah. has received a great deal of political traction recently. It's also, of course, a big issue in the United States itself, where Donald Trump's success should be understood as inextricably associated with the permeability of national borders as revealed through outsourcing, American companies moving offshore, the displacement of labour and capital outside territorial US borders and so on. During the paradigm of binary oppositions that characterised the Cold War, the United States bolstered its ideology of political freedom and liberty by setting these in stark contrast to the values of coercion and uniformity that it associated with the old Soviet Union. But the current American rivalry with China is far less susceptible to what Alan Nadell called containment culture, involving as it does a destabilizing of national economic well-being from within by the way multinational companies relocate production often to Asian centres where wages are low, profits are high, and American workers are consequently at increased risk of being made redundant. The mobility of transnational capital, in other words, undermines the rationale for domestic employment. In his 2006 book, The Audacity of Hope, Barack Obama himself admitted nostalgia for the old charms of an American longing for order. The pleasure I still get from watching a well-played baseball game, or my wife gets from watching reruns of the Dick Van Dyke Show, as Obama put it, as a slightly dodgy presidential thing, bearing in mind Reagan's fascination with old situation comedies as well. But he also admitted how these dreams of well-preserved order are finding themselves thwarted by complicated questions around global technology, with the immigration debate primarily signifying what Obama called not a loss of jobs, but a loss of sovereignty. Just one more example, like September the 11th, avian flu, computer viruses, and factories moving to China, that America seems unable to control its own destiny. Hence, Americans find they have an uncomfortable sense of what Obama termed their world turned upside down. In the face of what he described here as the challenges of transnational threats, Obama has developed during his administration a public policy of openness to change that attempts to convince Americans of how their market-based liberal economies represent the best chance of a better life, not only for themselves, but for people around the world. But this is clearly recognized as a tough challenge, and Obama's book cited Robert Rubin, US Treasury Secretary in the Bill Clinton administration, as saying that the issue of whether it might be possible to avoid a long-term decline in US living standards if we opened ourselves entirely to competition with much cheaper labour around the world is a complicated question. That was Rubin's phrase. This is, to say the least, not exactly a ringing endorsement expressing confidence in the capacity of the United States to triumph over all comers in a new world order. This crisis in borders has been brought on primarily by the widespread dissemination of new communications technologies, and it should not, I think, come as any surprise to scholars who have followed how American studies has grappled with various spectres of internationalization over the last 20 years. I think it's important for us to recognise the extent to which Brexit in Europe recently, Trump and similar phenomena are driven by intense popular anxieties about the impact of globalisation on people's everyday lives. We have to bring jobs back from places like China, Japan and Mexico, wrote Trump in his 2015 book, Crippled America, going on to say that America needs to bring our jobs back home where they belong. I understand, of course, the ethnocentrism of these reactions, what might seem like their disregard of other centres of world gravity. And it's also true, as the Democratic Party presidential campaign has pointed out, that with his own companies having profited enormously by making money overseas, Trump is an odd candidate to complain about outsourcing. But of course he's an odd candidate in lots of ways. And it's crucial that we as scholars of American studies understand the emotional appeal of the kind of speech Trump made at the Republican National Convention in July of this year, when he declared that Americanization, not globalism, will be our credo. When I was visiting Harvard this past summer to teach at the Institute for World Literature, there was a discussion at dinner about Brexit, which of course the distinguished international faculty members there strongly opposed, with one suggesting that such a fundamental constitutional change should only have come into effect if there had been a two-thirds majority for it, rather than the 52-48 split that actually occurred, even though in a voting demographic of about 26 million, this 4% majority still represents a popular mandate of over 1 million voters. I'm not, of course, expressing political sympathy with the Brexit position myself, and indeed, using my absentee vote from Australia, I voted for Britain to remain within the EU. Nevertheless, I am very uncomfortable with any notion that some people's votes should in practice be worth less than others, or that a popular plebiscite should be subject to manipulation by bureaucratic authorities in the interests of some kind of higher wisdom. Indeed, this notion that one particular group of people should in effect only be worth 3/5 of the other is a route we've been down before with very unhappy results. It was, of course, the 3/5 compromise that was reached between southern states and northern states during the 1787 US Constitutional Convention in relation to the question of how slaves would be counted when determining a state's total population for legislative purposes. Within different kinds of transnational market economies, it's essential that we don't now transfer over to class the forms of discrimination that used to be reserved for race. Rather than tracing what Donald Pease described as the imposition of an American exceptionalist mode across the whole globe in the interests of forestalling a permanent state of emergency, I want here to suggest an antithetical, but in some ways complementary, proposition, the ways in which US borders have dissolved to such an extent that they have merged seamlessly into a planetary continuum. As with the Donald Trump phenomenon, these two antithetical movements are paradoxically intertwined. Just as Trump's reactionary protectionism gains its purchase from the increasing fluidity of global borders, so Pease's attribution of an imperial state of American exceptionalism can be understood as a response to a multi-dimensional world in which the apparatus of unipolar power no longer holds good. Arjun Appadurai, in the 1990s, discussed global flows, as he put it, in terms of social and economic technologies. I just summarised those up there. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with them: ethnoscapes, mediascapes, technoscapes, financescapes, and ideoscapes. And this is, I think, just as a sideline, where I would want to disagree with a point raised in the previous session by Isabel Calderon and Gonzalo Chalon about when they cited Angela Davis saying transnational solidarity was needed to oppose neoliberalism and to force people to think of themselves in individual rather than collective terms. Because it does seem to me that this model that Appadurai provided in 1996 is not just an individualistic model, and that in some sense the technology can't simply be reduced to a particular political ideology of neoliberalism. But the particular frame I want to consider here, which in some ways develops from these, is that of the Anthropocene, taking technology in a new direction, an idea which has, of course, been very prominent in humanities discourse over the past few years. Ursula Heiser has summarized the Anthropocene as an era in which humans, functioning as a new geological force, transform even the most basic climate systems on the planet, so that the term itself, coined in 2000 by the scientist Paul Crutzen, is now seen as shorthand for the understanding that all inhabitants of planet Earth should be seen as involved mutually in a common ecological formation that crosses national borders. This can be seen as a development from the critical practices of transnationalism that emerged in the last decade of the 20th century. And it's no coincidence, I think, that many of the scholars involved with ecological approaches to the subject have themselves an oblique or hybridized intellectual relation to the American Academy. Heiser herself studied at the University of Cologne before going to California. She's now at UCLA, I think. Weichi Dimmock, whose edited collection Shades of the Planet has been influential in this area, was born in Hong Kong and now teaches at Yale, although her notion of deep time has, I think, residual affiliations with Chinese versions of temporality, which are doing similar kinds of things in a different way. While Dipesh Chakrabarty, who has done important theoretical work on the concept of climate change, was born in India and studied in Australia before moving to the University of Chicago, with one of his early books, Provincializing Europe, involving a decentering of traditional Western perspectives from both a geographical and a conceptual angle. Chakrabarty argued in his essay, Post-Colonial Studies and the Challenge of Climate Change, that the current conjuncture of globalization and global warming leaves us with the challenge of having to think of human agency over multiple and incommensurable scales at once. And such a problem of incommensurable scales poses particular epistemological problems for an area-based subject like American Studies, whose models of political resistance and agency have traditionally depended on a specific enclosure of territorial boundaries. It is this model of enclosure that facilitates the inclusion of diverse communities within a quasi-familial structure, as if the world of American Studies, and potentially the United States itself, were an extended community able to embrace difference within the time-honoured framework of e pluribus unum. There have admittedly been attempts to integrate some interventions in environmental studies within the radical oppositional dynamics of American Studies, as for example in the work of Sabine Wilk at the University of Washington, who has described the Anthropocene as what she called a serious challenge to the basic axioms of Western metaphysics. I hope you can just about see that. I'm sorry the words are a little small on that slide. Wilk has argued that in the framework of the Anthropocene, all relations between humans and non-humans unfold within the realm of interconnectivity, so that within this object-oriented ontology, the Kantian model of intellectual dualism becomes redundant. But such a political appropriation of the planetary environment, Wilk emphasised the need for what she called a normative framework of global environmental justice, risks overlooking the more inscrutable aspects of the Anthropocene, the fact that it is very difficult transparently to conceptualise or to measure. In his recent book, The Birth of the Anthropocene, Jeremy Davis, who incidentally lectures in English at the University of Leeds and is therefore perhaps more attuned in disciplinary terms at least to questions of representation, talked of the paradox whereby the Anthropocene of the geologists is actually not itself an Anthropocenic concept. In other words, the idea that climate change is man-made, the etymological origin of Anthropocene indicates man-made, as in anthropomorphic, made by man, interacts uneasily with a much more implausible notion that we can define this time through human scientific instruments. As Davis says, the Anthropocene intellectually is something that it would be possible to date reliably only in retrospect, just as we now talk about the Holocene, the Phanerozoic age, and so on. The fact that so many dates have been proposed as the starting point for the Anthropocene reinforces this sense of obscurity. Some have suggested 1492, when Columbus first discovered America. Some have preferred to point to the emergence of European capitalist regimes and global commodity capitalism in the 15th and 16th centuries. Still others have suggested that the boundary should be drawn much more recently, at the Manhattan Project's first nuclear test in 1945, or during the Cold War year of 1952, after the plutonium fallout from the first test of a full-scale thermonuclear device in the Marshall Islands. All of this reinforces Davis's point about how it's almost impossible to correlate such an extensive temporal scale within contemporary historical perspectives because of the radical differentials of scale that are involved. Here, just to sort of reinforce this point, is a short YouTube video tracking the breakup of Gondwanaland, by far the largest continent during the early part of the Phanerozoic age, into our current continental land formation. This is how your current continental designs were formed. That's the Earth as we know it today. According to the geologists, it was Gondwanaland that fragmented into South America, Africa, India, and an Australia-Antarctic formation some 100 million years ago. But Davis's point is that it's premature to try to inscribe the Anthropocene into any kind of chronostratigraphic chart, since we're not sure about it yet, and it may well be another 100 million years before we, or perhaps our scholarly descendants, if there are any, are able to take a more judicious perspective. Come back. There it is. Okay? Oh, sorry. Yes. This is the International Chronostratigraphic Chart that Davis refers to in his book. I won't go, you probably can't see it, you can't go, or you probably can't see all the details of it. But the straightforward point that I want to make is that it goes a long way back with these geological scales reckoned in the millions of years. So what we're left with here in 2016 is not so much a scientific truth or a political manifesto, but a theoretical hypothesis, a potentially productive but contested way of seeing. This theory of the Anthropocene should be understood as a heuristic rather than empirically verifiable category, but it still enables us to correlate contemporary conditions with deep time and with a radically dislocating temporal and spatial scale. As Shital Pravinchandra has written, recent environmental criticism has contributed to the impetus of boundary breaking across a range of intellectual disciplines, bringing the humanities into conversation with natural sciences, while considering how species thinking, along with the role of neuroscience and biomedicine, as well as of ecology, have intersected with the more traditional liberal consciousness. It has also contributed to what Michel Burnham has called the oceanic turn in American studies, and that's on your handout there, that reference, along with what Monique Elouet has described as the idea of a constitutionally coherent North America competing with the notion of a dissolving continent, a liquefying natural world. This in turn has seen Antarctica move from a peripheral place on the world map to the centre of consciousness. There's a map of the world from an Antarctic perspective. As the focus on polar ice caps melting ensures that relations among different geographical parts of the planet become integral rather than marginal to the concerns of area studies. You can see from the map here how the world takes on a different shape when seen from the South Pole perspective. Apart from anything else, you can easily see how close the tip of South America is to Antarctica. And it's strange now to think that until the Transcontinental Railroad was built in the 1860s in North America, cargo was moved from New York to San Francisco around Cape Horn at the tip of South America. It had to go all the way around from New York to San Francisco. It was the only way until the Panama Canal was opened in, I think, the 1890s. And interestingly, at that time, the 1850s, it was much quicker to go from San Francisco to Sydney than from San Francisco to New York. So if one's thinking about ways in which that trans-Pacific dynamic works, again, that's a kind of historically variable formation. Australia has also become more conceptually visible within this planetary domain. In his work A Reef in Time, for example, Australian ecological historian J.E.N. Veron used the focal point of the Great Barrier Reef to critically scrutinise the practice whereby human, biological, evolutionary and geological timeframes are described using the same words. And he argued that what he called this myopic approach led to both conceptual confusion and an incapacity to implement remedial policies to address climate change across broader temporal scales. This again is an example of the more activist kind of environmental politics, but it does suggest how the Cold War model of area studies, which involved a partition of the world into discrete regions and national formations, has now been superseded by an Anthropocenic model within which relations of reciprocity have become more crucial, not through any largesse on the part of the United States or Western Europe, but because both the new technology and the altered environmental ecology of the planet demand different intellectual structures. Australian environmental historian Libby Robin has complained of how most Anthropocene origin stories follow the deep wheel ruts of Northern Hemisphere history, as she put it, emphasising Pleistocene extinctions and agricultural revolutions rather than the very different type of ecological history in Southern Africa and Australia, despite the fact that the whole purpose of the Anthropocene is designed to address systems with a global reach. Despite such anomalies resulting from residual assumptions still centred in the Northern Hemisphere, these new aspects of planetary consciousness have manifestly brought the perspectives of the once occluded Southern Hemisphere more clearly into global view. I hope you can see that. This is the voyage of the Pequod in Moby Dick, and you can see that orange line. It starts off from Massachusetts and then sort of tracks into the Southern Hemisphere before coming a copper just north of the equator. But part of the point about this journey of the Pequod, as I discuss in Anthropocene in America, is that it goes so far south of the equator, with Melville in chapter 44 of the novel citing Lieutenant Maury of the National Observatory Washington, that's Melville's phrase, an important American hydrographer of the time, whose work, The Physical Geography of the Sea, strongly influenced the direction of commercial shipping routes. In this work, Maury noted how the circulation of southern ocean currents was broad and sluggish, as he put it, as opposed to the narrow, sharp and strong currents of the north. And he suggested that the world might usefully be divided into hemispheres, consisting the one with almost all the land in it, except Australia and a slip of America lying south of a line drawn from the desert of Atacama to Uruguay, the other an aqueous hemisphere containing all the great waters except the Atlantic Ocean, with New Zealand the nearest land to its centre. For Maury, such global asymmetry testified to a divine plan whereby the southern hemisphere had been mapped out in the original scheme of things as inherently subordinate to the northern. And he likened the former to the boiler and the latter to the condenser of the steam engine. Although such claims might now seem bizarre, this providential view of the physical circumference of Earth, a kind of cosmic version of manifest destiny, was relatively commonplace in the 1850s, and it was a notion shared by, among others, Maury's friend, the eminent Princeton geographer Arnold Guyot. The strategy of Melville in Moby Dick, however, is deliberately to interrogate Maury's assumptions by turning things around the other way, with metaphors of inversion being associated with ways of seeing as well as with specific geographic locations, as when death is described as the great South Sea of the other world. Within this southern hemispheric world of melting Antarctic ice, as Ian Balcom wrote in 2014, the new method of history no longer orients us toward a future measured against the promise of freedom, but instead a future marked by the threat of extinction. This is where environmental work comes into such sharp collision with a traditional emphasis of American studies on what Brooke Thomas called a narrative of progressive emergence, one in which marginalized groups, African Americans, Hispanics, the gay and lesbian community and so on, sought to achieve full recognition and entry into the privileged domain of American freedom. While such a model of progressive emergence consorts ill with the Anthropocenic imaginary, it does shed an interesting retrospective light on the role Native Americans have played in the formation of US national consciousness. In Walden, Henry David Thoreau mentions the arrowheads that he has turned up while hoeing, and he says this shows that an extinct nation had anciently dwelt here. And that kind of correlation between nationhood and extinction, the ways in which particular communities lie under the threat of annihilation, is a thread that runs through the work of Thoreau and other American writers. Put another way, we might say that the situation of the United States in the 21st century, living not so much with the promise of freedom, but under the permanent threat of extinction, brings it closer theoretically to the country of the Native Americans, where such threats of the displacement and deterritorialization of national communities have long lingered. And in this sense, we come to recognize more clearly the points of crossover between Native American and American studies. Joshua David Bellon has usefully commented on how critics have tended to overlook the Indians as determinants not just of Native American literature per se, but of American literature as a field more broadly. Bellin traced how this theme of intercultural interdependence, as he put it, can be found in Thoreau, Benjamin Franklin, Catherine Sedgwick, and other writers whose preoccupations overlap in illuminating ways with those of such Native American writers as Sampson Occam, the member of the Mohegan Nation in the 18th century, who became a Presbyterian cleric. In Catherine Sedgwick's Hope Leslie, published in 1827, the conversion narratives associated with the 17th century Puritan settlers are played off against the sense of contrariety and contradiction that derives in part from the structural anachronism whereby the novel itself is set 200 years earlier, so that the narrative implicitly contradicts linear models of history and instead emphasizes the fictive quality of history, thereby dissolving antitheses between Indian and white settler history. Indeed, Sedgwick's whole novel is grounded on a style of double anachronism, through which the retroactive reworking of white history becomes commensurate to the longue durée of Indian history, which is similarly only accessible in partial forms through rhetorical fragments. As Geoffrey Inscoe has observed in a fine essay on Sedgwick's novel, the narrative effectively signifies in two different temporal registers at once, relying throughout the novel on a comic interplay among conventional temporal formations. Saturday evening is described as a wrong season for temporalities by one of the Puritan characters, for example, whilst Sir Philip Gardner, disguising himself as a Puritan, complains loudly about the prospect of trespassing on holy time, in a way that he imagines will recommend him to this New England community. The point here, of course, is that this is precisely what the novel itself does, trespasses on holy time, or rather it reconfigures temporal variation as one aspect of cultural difference, thinking about ways in which time and space are projected as variable measures, how different communities adduce their own templates of sacred time. Dano Luciano has done some important work recently on the proliferation of temporalities in 19th century American culture and on the lack of futurity generally associated with Native American culture, its disavowal of linear or progressive teleology. Instead, Luciano advocated a need to emphasize what she called the historicity of time itself, an area that in 2007 she suggested new historicism had not ventured into. Helen Carr has also written well about the curious modulation through which the idea of the Indian moved from being in the 18th century a symbol of the states themselves, something seen in Benjamin Franklin's 1751 letter on how the Iroquois League would furnish a model for the American Constitution, to becoming by the mid-19th century a definition of everything Americans were not. But my suggestion here is that a different kind of Anthropocenic emphasis on the prospect of extinction, or on how US culture relates to radically different timescales, offers an opportunity to see ways in which American studies can be understood as having always had a contingent rather than necessary relationship to particular spatial and temporal borders. Indeed, the theme of this symposium, Homelands and the Borders of America, might be understood reflexively in relation to the borders of American studies, since it is the problematic circumference of the subject that is most immediately at stake here. The question of how American borders change if they are seen from the outside in, rather than from the inside out, is a key question for both America and American studies in the 21st century. This new kind of theoretical model involves an extension from the spatial transnational framework into what I am calling the cross-temporal, where the movement beyond national borders involves queering the boundaries of time as well as space. In a recent essay on Melville and Pacific perspectives, Melissa Nyadak from the University of Toronto linked the idea of reading Melville from a different geographical situation in New Zealand to the experience of being surrounded by actual whales and witnessing what she called the intensity and intimacy of the moment as the bulk of the whale surfaced near the whaleboat. Interestingly, she linked this phenomenological reading to a swerve away from more abstract universalist interpretations, a swerve compatible with a kind of mobile positioning and demystification of centralized authority that Melville's fiction itself invites. Nyadak aptly noted that a text such as Benito Sereno, for example, is all about reading and the places that we read from. This recognition of how reading practices, and indeed practices of cultural interpretation in general, are bound up in systems of power, enables us to reconstitute the homelands and borders of America within the Anthropocene era through the light of inverse spatio-temporal formations of the kind projected by Australian visual artist Fiona Hall in her 2014 installation Wrong Way Time. Hall's exhibition, which was featured at the Venice Biennale last year, consisted of a series of visual artworks specifically designed to challenge conventional understandings and assumptions about temporality. The glass face of one of Hall's title clocks was masked by a red U-turn painted anti-clockwise over the growth rings of a tree, as if to exemplify disjunctions between human measures and natural time, and hence, as the exhibition's curator Linda Michael put it, a sense that anthropocentrism is coming to an end. Hall's conceit of time moving in the wrong way might be regarded as a critique of global politics and world finance, a sense of how we seem to be going backwards in an era of what David Hanson, in an essay on Hall, called planetary ecocide. But as Michael acknowledged, this idea is also linked by Hall to the potential for transformation, an imaginative capacity to reorder the material world by approaching it from a counterclockwise perspective and thus interrogating the norms of progressive sequence. Hall insisted that Wrong Way Time was centered around a global vantage point, and the exhibition included many ornamental intercalations of clocks with skulls. There's one there, you can see the hands of the clock perched on the skull's nose, along with a sustained emphasis on inversion, as exemplified by the truncated legend emblazoned on the case of one clock: endings are the new beg, short for beginnings. Another work for this exhibition, Kuka Hiretidija, Animals from Another Time, featured models concocted from native grasses and other materials of extinct and endangered creatures taken from the Australian desert, constructed collaboratively by Hall and the Tijani desert weavers, with these animals being outfitted in layers of military camouflage to register the damaging effects of British colonisation, including its atomic testing on the Maralinga lands in the 1950s, on the fragile desert ecosystem and lives of Aboriginal people. Hall spoke of the quirkiness and humour in her exhibition, and there is a darkly comic mise en abîme here, where the fake animals appear to wear a garb of camouflage, a mode of dress whose operating principle is itself to provide a simulated likeness to nature so as to allow soldiers to blend in with their surroundings. Hall's Wrong Way Time thus carries multiple resonances, implying not only time's wrong directions, but also ways in which any attempt to reconstitute the past necessarily involves a reflexive style of anachronism and reversal. This is consistent with the reflexive style of anachronism and reversal in Sedgwick's Hope Leslie, as I was suggesting earlier, and indeed with the whole problematic nature of the representation of global indigenous culture, which involves questions of mistranslation and hybrid affiliation across different discursive spaces. And I just wanted to mention, we didn't have time in the last session, but Chadwick Allen's recent book, Trans-Indigenous, which I think does a terrific job of talking about global indigenous cultures in the light of movement between different spaces. He talks about how Maori culture, for instance, has become a global phenomenon, not just localized in a particular place, but a political thing. There's a UN committee now on global indigenous peoples. So it's become something which is very much part of a contemporary political framework. And I was interested in what Isabel Alves was talking about earlier in relation to Linda Hogan, the whole question of how indigenous cultures relate to the homeland. But I think we should think of that in global and not just localized terms. So just as Hall works with Australian Aboriginal culture and extrapolates from it a radically different perspective on Western time, so Native American culture comes within the Anthropocene to be acknowledged as a constitutive part of the American domain at large, in the same way as America itself should be seen as a constituent, if sometimes reluctant part, of a wider planetary orbit. It's got a few more pages to go. In a report on the comparative literature field in 2014, Ursula Heiser specifically linked the emerging strand of multi-species ethnography in eco-criticism to the work of anthropologists and literary critics such as Deborah Bird-Rose and Tom Van Duren working in Australia. While David Christian's notion of big history, as he puts it, which he described as an attempt to tell a coherent story about the past on many different scales, also arose out of an Australian context, with the English-born author writing maps of time while teaching Russian history at Macquarie University in Sydney. Christian's work, which has been financially supported in a massive way by the Bill Gates Foundation. The story is that Bill Gates was in his gym one day and just saw this on some kind of iPad or something, and said, oh, I must fund that. And so they had stacks and stacks of money to play with. But it's attempted to correlate human history with planetary history, starting with cosmology, geology and history before delving into life on Earth. And it paid tribute explicitly to its Antipodean provenance, arguing that taken together, these stories have all the power and richness of a traditional cycle of creation myths. They constitute what Indigenous Australians might call a modern dreaming, a coherent account of how we were created and how we fit into the scheme of things. I myself, I have to say, I'm quite sceptical about the elements of anthropomorphic fantasy associated with Christian's notion of big history, which are evident enough in the kind of striking parallel he adduced here between cosmic and human processes. Just as in the early universe gravity took hold of clouds and atoms and sculpted them into stars and galaxies, Christian writes, so around 3000 BCE, by a sort of social gravity, citizen states were sculpted from scattered communities of farmers. But what is particularly interesting about this analogy is not its perspicacity, but the ways in which such a bizarre derangement of scales, in Timothy Clark's phrase, is characteristic of environmental criticism more generally, whereby the attempt to link local to planetary perspectives, seeking to alleviate catastrophic climate change by not leaving household electrical appliances on standby, in Clark's example, produces a paratactic juxtaposition of microcosmic and macrocosmic that is almost surreal in its effects. Indeed, the most challenging cross-temporal work, so I would argue, has not been of the kind that has, like Christian, sought implausibly to adumbrate alternative creation myths, but that which has openly correlated an interface among spatial or temporal dimensions traditionally appearing incommensurate. For example, Rosalind Haynes has argued that by juxtaposing radically different time schemes, the Australian desert implies the relative nature of time and thus creates an enigmatic landscape where conventional coordinates derived from Newtonian physics appear to dissolve. Similarly, Timothy Morton drew on the 2015 work Untitled by Aboriginal artist Ukulchi Napangati to support his theory of how the gigantic timescales associated with hyperobjects have the effect of producing a disorientation of scale among human communities. Morton particularly commended this work as holding the viewer in a series of crisscrossing interference patterns. He went on to cite global warming as a typically non-local hyperobject, one massively distributed in time and space. And describing himself as a queer ecologist, he disavowed any association of ecology with manifestos of domestic purity by probing conceptual crossovers between different temporal orders. True planetary awareness, wrote Morton in 2013, is the creeping realization not that we are the world, but that we aren't. The idea of homeland similarly has a negative or inverse dimension built into it, the homeland that once was. There is always an elegiac aspect to the term, since it implies a protected entity that can be reclaimed only nostalgically or is always on the verge of being lost. When the administration of George W. Bush transformed the idea of home into the more formalized construct of Homeland Security, it paradoxically drew attention to the vulnerability of a space that, during most of the 20th century, was a naturalized domain, taken for granted by white Americans as their natural birthright. To translate a home into a homeland is by definition to render it permeable, susceptible of being infiltrated by outside agents. There are many positive attributes to such a deconstruction of proprietorial conceptions of the home territory, of course, particularly in relation to racial and gender politics. But it is precisely the emotional reaction against such an amorphous sense of displacement that has driven the success of Donald Trump's carnivalesque politics, where he gets to say, like the carnival court jester, what people think but dare not articulate. But hardly less irrational to my mind is the attempt to reclaim America as a redeemer nation in the work of William Spanos, who has complained of the tendency of recent New Americanist studies to over-determine the global perspective at the expense of the local, and who is keen to re-emphasize the mythic status of American exceptionalism and the violence that it has always disavowed. Spanos highlights how a Calvinist providential view of history still influences the American national psyche, which on one level is fair enough. But to regard American as simply a synonym for exceptionalism, in the way Spanos does, is radically to underestimate all the pressures of geographical and historical materialism that have always circumscribed the American scene of exception. The geographical ecology that circumscribes the United States is not new. The country has had the same continental shape for the past 100 million years or so. But recent theoretical developments have enabled, and indeed required us, to understand this geography in a new way, to recognize how America relates to the wider world, rather than simply accepting it on its own terms as a shining city on a hill, in John Winthrop's famous phrase from 1630. America is in truth no more of a providential state than is Israel or Britain or indeed Portugal. They are all political territories with legal borders and certain forms of national jurisdiction, historically determined, whose hold on planetary affairs has become increasingly tenuous in a world of nuclear proliferation, economic outsourcing and global warming. Just as a sideline to this, I was reading on the plane on the way over to this symposium the latest issue of the journal New Literary History, a special issue entitled Recomposing the Humanities with Bruno Latour, where there are several essays on the Anthropocene, on the environmental humanities, and on ways in which Latour's work on network theory has helped to shape this discourse, including contribution from Dipesh Chakrabarty, who, as I was mentioning earlier, has been, I think, the leading figure of this field. But it did strike me when looking over these articles that all of this work on the Anthropocene is of a fundamentally predictive nature, anticipating the notion of impending threats. And in that sense, it bears some similarities to the Cold War fictions of mid-20th century America, which were constructed under the shadow of nuclear catastrophe. When we look back now at these works from the 1950s, we're less concerned with the nuclear science in itself than with ways in which its shadow impacted upon the narratives of this era. And similarly, I think cultural texts of the early 21st century incorporate an interface with science, an openness to biological and genetic diversity, including the lives of animals, as was mentioned earlier today, and a critique of the assumptions informing traditional liberal humanism in a way that enables us imaginatively to reconceptualize the American past as well as the American future. I'm not so concerned here with a proselytizing agenda, nor with questions of scientific accuracy that in any case I'm not competent to judge. But whether in 50 years' time Bangladesh and the Netherlands have been flooded, or whether technological advances have rendered these questions moot, I still think it will be a matter of historical note that the Anthropocenic imaginary of the early 21st century helped to displace and reconstruct the borders of American studies according to a wider geological circumference within which national formations found themselves incorporated within a planetary orbit. In his book, The Post-National Constellation, Jürgen Habermas said that the politician had not yet appeared who had dared to approach the question of how electoral politics might work in the post-national era, with all politicians preferring to recycle the myth that all complex issues are still capable of being resolved within the national domain. This is the last slide. It would take a brave politician to go to the electorate and admit openly the limitations of his or her jurisdiction. Although I think that Obama has come quite close to assuming this persona on several occasions during his second term in office, and this may well be one reason for his relative unpopularity among the general public. And I actually saw a clip on BBC World last night where he said that if there was one thing he wanted to be remembered for, was that it was persuading Americans that they lived in an interdependent world, whether they liked it or not. Hard and complicated questions are always difficult to explicate, and this is why international American studies will continue to be important, because it refuses as a matter of principle to accept the domestic narratives of US exceptionalism on their own terms. The emotional reaction in defense of a spectral American exceptionalism that we see among Trump supporters, and not a few scholars today, is akin to an investment in rhetorical fictions of country, and it's entirely understandable in its own way. But the task of today's international American studies community is to acknowledge how the borders of America operate as cultural fictions, while having a much more problematic existence in relation to global jurisdiction and the harsh realities of international politics. The 21st century is not a borderless world, but it is a world in which the tension between protected space and deterritorializing impulses have been ratcheted up to a degree where everyday lives have become radically destabilized. And one function of 21st century Americanist scholars, wherever in the world they may happen to be based, is to analyze how these fictions of homelands and borders circulate both aesthetically and politically.